So hi, everybody. My name is Lissa Weinmann, and I'm a volunteer here at the Brattleboro Literary Festival. And I'm really so pleased to be with you this morning with Jia Lynn Yang, who's written an incredible book called One Mighty and an Irresistible Tide, The Epic Struggle Over American Immigration from 1924 to 1965. And it's really fitting that Jia Lynn is one of the first writers that we're featuring on this 20-year anniversary of the Brattleboro Literary Festival. It's been 20 years since Saul Bellow first helped initiate the literary festival. And as some of you know, Saul is buried here in Brattleboro, and his legacy and his love of writing has sort of lived on through the literary festival. And although we can't be here in our beautiful town to enjoy each other's presence, Zoom is the next best thing. So thank you all for being here today. As I said, we're here to, I want to just do some housekeeping. If you could please silence your cell phones and you'll be kept muted throughout the proceedings. But at the end, if you have a question you'd like to ask, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And we will go through the questions as they were presented at the end. Jia Lynn will talk for about 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions. I'll probably ask the first question. My role as moderator, but please do put your questions in ahead of time, and we will get to them before we adjourn the meeting at 10:45. So I have to say that this book is just terrific. I've loved every minute of it. It's probably one of the best things that happened in 2020. Jia Lynn Yang is the national national editor of the New York Times. And she covers a wide range of issues. You can, read all about her, but this is her first book. Before she came to the New York Times as deputy national editor, and I believe it was 2017, and then became national editor in short order. Good work, Jia Lynn. She was the deputy national security editor of the Washington Post, and as she was part of the team that covered the relationship between Trump and Russia, and won a Pulitzer Prize for that work, that very, very important reporting work that we're still feeling the ramifications from. She was at the Washington Post for over a decade covering business and economics. She grew up in Northern Virginia and attended Yale University. And she currently lives in Brooklyn with her husband and her daughter, Ming, who it seems you were pregnant with while you were writing the book. So really doubly, triply productive, very, very impressive. So it's a pleasure to have you, Jia Lynn. I'm just going to turn it over to you now and look forward to our question and answer session.
Thank you so much, Lissa. Good morning, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry we can't be together in person, but I'm honored to be here with all of you to talk about my book. So I thought I would start with the question I always like to ask people who write books, which is, why did you write this book? Books are just so much work. They take years and years. And so I thought I'd start with kind of my own origin of how I came to write this book, talk a little bit about sort of the arc of the history generally, read an excerpt, and then take questions from Lissa and all of you. So why this book? It all began in early 2016, which was a time, if we can kind of go back, that I think none of us, or very few of us, believed that Donald Trump would become president. So immigration was not, at that moment at least, a huge issue the way that it has been for several years now. And I was in Austin, Texas for a friend's wedding and wanted to go to the Lyndon Johnson Presidential Museum and Library because I love reading histories about the 1950s and 60s. I just find that era, I love politics, and the political history of that time is just totally fascinating because so many things in American society change, right? You get the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the creation of Medicare, Medicaid, just transformative moments. And so I wanted to go to this museum and check it out myself. So my husband and I stopped in, and there's a room in that museum for anyone who's gone or is interested in going that talks about a lot of what I'm just describing, the so-called Great Society project, as Lyndon Johnson named it. And it's just this room filled with everything that he touched and created through his administration. And there was a corner in the room that described a law that I have to confess that I'd never heard of. And it mentioned that there was also a law, in addition to everything I've named, he also signed a law called the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act. And it mentions, just very quickly, there's a photo of him. I still remember this part of the museum. There's a photo of him signing this law underneath at the foot of the Statue of Liberty in New York. And it mentions very quickly, this law explains why there are so many people from outside Europe who are in this country, in particular Asian Americans. Now, when I read this line and I thought about my family, I began to have all kinds of questions, because my family came here after 1965. You know, there have been Chinese Americans in this country for generations. Starting from the gold rush, in the 19th century, but my family and many of the families that I grew up around who were from Asia or the Middle East or Latin America came after 1965. So I began to wonder, is my family's presence here somehow directly connected to this law? And so it became, it's a little bit like genealogy. You can find out who your, great-grandparents are, great-great-grandparents are. That's hard in my family in some ways, because we left China in 1949. So this project became a way of finding kind of a political genealogy, right? Not to assume that we would have been allowed here, but to say, if we are here, what laws were in place at the time to make it so? And what I learned just taught me so much and surprised me so much. I spent the next basically 3-4 years, I was working at the Washington Post at the time. My husband was also writing a book about the economist John Maynard Keynes. We would go to the Library of Congress, and I was living in DC at the time, every weekend, just pouring through old documents and books to pull together this history. And a couple of things I'd say that I found were pretty surprising, at least for me. And I confess, I was someone coming into this without a terribly deep knowledge of immigration history. But one is that I think we really take for granted just how unique our current immigration system is. We're used to all these visas, all these numerical caps, very closed borders that essentially, they're trying to be closed, at least. Of course, people are crossing, but there are deportations. 100 years ago, we had almost none of that. Basically, we had open borders. There were no numerical caps at the US-Mexico border. There were no numerical caps coming from Europe or Asia. If you could make the journey into the US, you effectively were admitted. Very, very, very few people were rejected at the border. When they came, they would sort of walk across the US-Mexico border and come back and forth. At Ellis Island, you would have a cursory check, but the vast majority of people came in, same with Angel Island in California. So it was a very porous system, and there were no visas. So when you decided to come, you didn't have to have any paperwork on you. And that alone to me was so striking, because I think we talk about a nation of immigrants like there's a linear story here from Ellis Island to now. And in fact, what I learned is that we actually had, open borders, no caps. And over time, we have added more and more and more restrictions. And I say that in a very neutral way. I don't know, what system we should have, but it just struck me looking at the history that there's actually this whole debate that got us from open borders to where we are now. So the book begins in the 1920s, because that's when the scenario, the situation I'm describing is really beginning to change. So we have, as a result of new technology that lets people transport themselves across oceans in the span of weeks, there's a flood of immigrants coming in from Southern and Eastern Europe to places like New York, where I'm sitting now. So this is just a huge, historic, unprecedented wave of people from Italy, from Eastern Europe, Jews, Catholics, and they are completely transforming cities like New York, Chicago, Philly, certainly in the Northeast. And as a backlash to that, people begin to ask, well, why do we have open borders? Shouldn't we be restricting who's coming? These people, they speak different languages, they have different religions, they're very different, and they don't seem like what America is and should be kept stable as. This is a debate happening after World War I, which is a very, a completely ill-fated war, a little bit, in my mind, a little bit like the Iraq War, where people were very uncomfortable getting involved. They never quite understand by the end the purpose of it. So the country is in this very deep isolationist crouch when they begin debating in the 20s what to do about all these immigrants who keep showing up at Ellis Island and changing the country. And so what they do is that in 1924, they pass extremely strict quotas, and the country begins to put a cap on how many immigrants are here. Now, what's really important about these quotas is that they're ethnic quotas. So they're not just saying we can only take so many people, they're also saying there are some people we really want and some people we don't want. And so it's essentially ranks ethnic groups by desirability. And the upshot is that the quotas really prioritize people from, let's say, sort of Northwest Europe, so England, that corner of Europe. And it says explicitly with the quotas, we don't want as many people from Italy. We don't want people from Eastern Europe. It also begins to say, we don't want people from Asia, because anyone who seems like a threat to kind of, American culture, American kind of bloodlines, this is when eugenics is extremely popular, very mainstream, is considered a threat to the country. It's a threat to the country's stability as its culture conceives of itself as, a white Protestant place. It's potentially a threat in terms of, this is a Red Scare time, so there's a fear of, people who are communist coming and sort of threatening the republic from within. For all these reasons, the country puts in place just these very, very strict ethnic quotas. So once that's put in place, the idea, when it happened, people think that this is it forever. They're like, we're done with all these immigrants. They say we're explicitly turning away from being a place for the huddled masses, right? From the Emma Lazarus poem at the foot of the Statue of Liberty. We are not a refuge for people. So this is holding, for decades. And my book is really about how those quotas are undone, and it takes 40 years for that to happen. And what I argue in the book is that, in fact, if not for a handful of people spending those 40 years, some of them the entire 40 years, but many of them kind of passing a baton, we would still have these ethnic quotas. And we would still have a country that is much more ethnically and culturally homogeneous than the one we have now, which, of course, as we know, is demographically transforming before our eyes. And the argument of the book is that because these quotas are abolished finally in 1965, this is very much why the country is as ethnically and racially diverse as it is now. So the story goes through, after they passed the quotas, World War II, because of the quotas, when the Holocaust begins, the country has no capacity really to admit Jewish refugees. They're living exactly in the countries that we've decided as a nation we don't want. Refugee laws are passed, and Lissa, I think you and I might talk a little bit about that later, of what it means now. Refugee laws are passed to kind of get around the quotas, and meanwhile, there's really an effort to try to undo them. So I'll stop there with kind of my thoughts. I wanted to read an excerpt for all of you. The book is really trying to tell it through a lot of people and individuals and characters. Immigration law is, I find, incredibly dry. It's a lot of legal stuff, a lot of categories. I thought I wanted to write the kind of book that I would want to read, which is one that's really told through people. So the excerpt I want to read is just about a central figure in this is not just Lyndon Johnson at the end when he signs the law, but John F. Kennedy, who of course precedes Johnson and is someone who's kind of an unlikely, I'll just say this to set a very, an Irish American icon, a Catholic American icon, but given his sort of upbringing and wealth, sort of an unlikely icon for those Americans, but he becomes one. I think I would argue in the book a little bit out of political expediency. And he begins to embrace immigration as part of his platform and part of his pitch to these voters of, I'm really on your side. These are kind of, in some ways, the moment in the 50s and 60s, the minority voters of the time are the Jews and Catholics who are becoming a larger and larger part of the Democratic Party. So the excerpt I wanted to read is from, it's 1963. So JFK has been president for about 2 years. He's not getting a lot done. He's been distracted by the Bay of Pigs, a whole host of foreign policy issues. We're in the throes of the Cold War, of course. And he is getting pressure, though, to finally deal with immigration. So just to review, these really strict, explicitly racist quotas have been in place for close to 40 years by this point. Every effort to undo them has been rebuffed. But JFK here really wants to change it. So I'll just read a couple of pages and then we can maybe go to questions. On July 23rd, Kennedy sent a message to Congress outlining his ambition. The existing quotas would be cut by 20% every year and assigned to a new general pool until they disappeared altogether within 5 years. The Asia-Pacific Triangle, restricting immigration from that continent, would be abolished. The new system would cap overall immigration at about 165,000 per year. Rather than select people based on country of origin, Kennedy's plan would prioritize those with the greatest ability to add to the national welfare, most likely referencing engineers, doctors, teachers, and scientists. The next highest priority would go to those reuniting with family, including unmarried adult children of parents already living in the country. No country would receive more than 10% of the total number of immigrants allowed under the overall cap. And in a clear break from the eugenics era, those with mental illnesses or epilepsy would no longer be barred. Philip Hart of Michigan quickly introduced a bill to mirror the White House's proposal in the Senate, and Emanuel Celler did the same in the House. Newspaper editorial boards raved about the plan. The Washington Post called it the best immigration law within living memory to bear a White House endorsement. The New York Times said that if Congress were to adopt the recommendations, it would be an act of justice and wisdom, as well as evidence that we fully understand the true nature of the changed world now grown so small in which all humanity lives. The White House was so eager to sell the legislation that work began to resurrect Kennedy's pamphlet, A Nation of Immigrants, in a publishing deal with Harper and Row as a new and enlarged edition that would be double the length of the original. The process would be quick. Harper and Row planned to deliver finished books within a month of receiving a final manuscript. The book version would require even less of Kennedy's participation than the pamphlet. Again, his aide, Mike Feldman, would be deeply involved with assistance from staff at the ADL, Anti-Defamation League, and Edward Samus, a special projects writer for Harper and Row. The added pages would come from many more photographs, an expanded section paying tribute to immigrants who had enriched American life, and a longer chapter on the country's current law, with some of Kennedy's recent message to Congress integrated into the book. Now, I'll just say quickly, this is a moment too where the biggest roadblock to the legislation has just died. His name was Francis Walter, so just to say that. But even with, and it makes people think that reform can happen, but even with Walter gone, Democrats in the House could not agree about what to do on immigration. Celler made a play to become the new chair of the Immigration Subcommittee after feeling thwarted for years on reform. He also tried to expand the subcommittee from 5 to 7 members to bring in more liberal congressmen. But his colleagues in the Judiciary Committee rebelled, and instead, Walter's replacement was Michael Theon, a tall, dour congressman from Ohio who seemed to always carry a worried look on his face. Theon had grown up wealthy as the son of John T. Theon, former owner of the Cleveland Indians baseball team and co-founder of the successful Standard Brewing Company. After attending Princeton University and Harvard Law School, he had joined a law firm with his 4 brothers called, accurately, Theon, 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 and Theon. The New York Times reporter noted in 1965 that Theon had given up golf 5 years earlier and no longer seemed to have any hobbies or interests outside politics. In a word, he was dull. There were a number of reasons to believe that Theon might be amenable to the Kennedy proposal. In his first election to Congress in 1942, he defeated a right-wing isolationist, positioning himself as a liberal alternative to his opponent. His district included the west side of Cleveland, home to many Polish, Hungarian, and Slovak immigrants. And in 1958, he had sponsored a bill to add Hungarian refugees. But Theon was erratic and petty, and his career in the House, which lasted nearly 3 decades, was marked chiefly by his ability to get himself reelected, as a journalist from Life put it. Despite hopes that Theon would prove to be more liberal than Walter, the Ohio congressman was frequently motivated by conservative impulses. In early 1964, he became infamous for trying to revoke a visa for the Welsh actor Richard Burton because Theon thought his romance with Elizabeth Taylor, his co-star in the blockbuster Cleopatra, was a public outrage. Because the two actors were still married to other people, Burton's presence in the country would be detrimental to the morals of the youth of the nation. It looked soon as though the immigration bill would join the graveyard of other failed legislative efforts by the Kennedy White House. In August, the Post noted that congressional approval of Kennedy's legislative request was at an all-time low of 5%, while the number of requests was at an all-time high. In that summer, the country was consumed by growing unrest over civil rights. On June 12th, just hours after Kennedy delivered a televised message to the country appealing for an end to racial discrimination, Mississippi civil rights leader Medgar Evers was shot and killed in front of his home. In early November, the effort to reform the country's immigration laws now appeared to be unraveling. Still, Feldman pressed forward with the Nation of Immigrants book, soliciting advice in the manuscript from Arthur Schlesinger Jr. But on November 4th, the historian blasted the draft, saying it was not ready for publication as a book for adults. In its present form would do damage to the president's reputation as a historian. The historian advised either turning the project into a children's book or bringing in an outside historian to fix it. 2 days later, Feldman asked Julius Edelstein, a former Senate aide and immigration policy expert, to help draft a chapter. I hate to give generous volunteers deadlines, but I must have the material before I leave for Japan, and I'm leaving for Japan on November 21st. Kennedy had asked Feldman to go to Tokyo as part of a large American delegation, including 6 cabinet secretaries, to discuss trade issues. The president himself was unavailable. A trip to Dallas had long been planned, primarily for Kennedy to shore up support ahead of his re-election campaign and to raise money for local Democrats. Lyndon Johnson, whose grasp of Texas politics was keener than anyone's, doubted that a trip to Dallas would improve matters on legislation like immigration, but he was loyal to Kennedy. On November 22nd, Feldman and more than half the administration's cabinet secretaries were flying on a special Air Force jet bound for Japan when a message came over a teletype machine that the president had been shot. Dean Rusk was the first to see it. He called the others to the front of the plane. Well, that doesn't mean anything, Feldman remembered saying to everyone else. He's been shot, but so has Orville, referring to Orville Freeman, the agriculture secretary, standing near him on the plane, who had survived a bullet passing through his chin and his skull during the Battle of Guadalcanal during World War II. Moments later, though, another message came. Hope gave way to stunned silence, grief, and fear. As the plane turned back to Honolulu to refuel before heading back to Washington, Feldman remembered looking outside and seeing military planes surrounding them. When the plane stopped in Hawaii, an Air Force doctor came on board to deliver tranquilizers to some passengers too upset to bear the news. On the journey home, as everyone sat in silence, lost in thought, Feldman resolved to resign from his job. He bore no animus toward Johnson. He simply could not imagine remaining in the White House with Kennedy gone. After the plane landed in Washington at 2 a.m., he went to the Oval Office to leave a letter of resignation on the president's desk. When he walked in, he nearly fainted. The room he had come to know so well had a rug with a new color, a deep red compared to the green from before, ordered by Jackie Kennedy before the trip to Texas. Thinking at first that he had hallucinated, Feldman quickly dropped off his letter and walked out, imagining he would never set foot in the room again. Earlier that day, a senator named James Eastland and his wife had been driving through Virginia on the senator's annual long drive home to Mississippi so that he could use his car over the Christmas holidays. At mid-afternoon, they reached US 11 in the Shenandoah Valley when they noticed flags flying at half-mast. Turning on the radio, they learned that Kennedy had died. Good God, Lyndon's president, said Eastland, who knew immediately that while Kennedy could be stopped on Capitol Hill on issues such as immigration, his successor would not. Quote, he's gonna pass a lot of this damn fool stuff. So I'll stop there. I hope that was legible. Basically what happens is that Kennedy is in the middle of pushing for this overhaul. He dies, obviously unexpectedly, and then Johnson has to take it the rest of the way.
Thank you so much for that presentation and reading, Jia Lynn. You said in your introduction that you were surprised that it was not really immigration, and this idea of the American melting pot it wasn't a linear story. And I too was very surprised when I read the book about, I'd always thought that was the prevailing narrative with bumps along the way, but I was really shocked at some of the really racist, incredibly racist comments that were made by different characters in the Congress at the time that these caps and quotas were being discussed. And I was wondering if you could just you really were masterful in taking what could be very dry information and bringing it to life through these senators, mostly the senators, because all the action mostly took place in the Congress. Also with President Johnson and Truman in particular. But could you talk a little bit about the characters like Senator Pat McCarran, who I actually hadn't even heard about, that wild man from Nevada, and the reprehensible Eastman, who resembles some of the Trumpian characters we are dealing with now. And also some of the sort of good guys like Celler and Lehman, for instance. Could you talk a little bit about how these sort of war played out through these characters and paint a picture of some of the characters for folks who might not have had the pleasure of reading the book yet?
Yeah, so it was interesting because you can see the debate going back in a very similar way as it is now. There are just always people who believe that the country should be sort of culturally preserved in some way, and that the immigrants, and over time it's different people, right? It's sometimes Catholics, it's sometimes Jews. Now it's often Mexicans, Haitians, sort of largely non-white immigrants, I'd argue, are going to really ruin the country. And somebody like Pat McCarran, he mentioned, is a senator. If anyone's flown into Las Vegas airport, the airport is named after him. I think there's a controversy now to sort of rename the airport given his history. He's someone who was head of the Senate Judiciary Committee for decades. So it's one of those people where you don't know the name anymore, but he just had such power when he was in Congress, and he controlled all the bills that came to the floor. And he was keenly interested in immigration. He himself was the son of Irish immigrants, but was very, very anti-immigrant, which happens. I think we sometimes assume that people from immigrant families are just by definition pro-immigrant. It's not true. People often feel like, in fact, a greater sense of ownership of the country and its national identity, and can feel like others who are not like them are a threat to it. So he spends years blocking the legislation, and is a big reason why, as I said at the outset, it takes 40 years to undo the quotas, because he's got this powerful position. He's sort of the grand poobah of Nevada politics, and he just stops it time after time. Another person who is sort of there for 40 years and is sort of, I would credit largely for the legislation passing it all, is Emanuel Celler, who's a congressman from Brooklyn. I think he probably didn't represent the very spot I'm in now, but very close by. His constituents were Jews and Italians, and he himself was the grandson of German Jewish immigrants. And he was elected to Congress right before the quotas passed that I was describing in the 20s. And then his name is in the 1965 law. So he spends decades in Congress. He's the chair of the House Judiciary Committee. And it's really thanks to his kind of tireless effort to change these quotas that you get to 1965. But just a really interesting person. His fingerprints are all over the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. When you think about all that stuff in the 60s, the civil rights movement, and how it's translated into action in Congress, Emanuel Celler is at the heart of so much of that.
Interesting. And what about the relation? I never heard of McCarran, but a lot of it was tied up in initially, pure racial discrimination against Jews, and they made no bones about the language they used on this Senate and House floor at the time, which you amply quote in the book. And it's just shocking. But at least it's out in the open. It's not sort of covert the way perhaps it still is today. But can you talk a little bit about Lehman also, the role of Lehman in the movements?
Yeah, so it's such a long battle that it takes a handful of people to sort of keep it going. And I think of Lehman as someone he doesn't live to see the 1965 law passed, but he's a fascinating person too. He comes from this extremely wealthy family of German Jews. They're the founders of, the Lehman brothers, right, which lasted until the financial crisis. They're from the South, oddly enough, in Alabama, but they settle in New York. And he basically sort of participates in the family business of banking, but kind of turns away and really is a public-minded figure who is really involved in philanthropy, and then is lieutenant governor actually under FDR. First Jewish lieutenant governor of New York. And then he has this sort of late in his life, this whole career in the Senate. And he's basically just a total like diehard liberal who loses all the time. So this is the 50s. He's constantly, Truman is not terribly popular at this time. Truman also, I think, is sort of a misunderstood figure. He's a little bit like a proto LBJ. A lot of what you see him trying to do, he's trying to pass universal health care. He's trying to pass civil rights legislation. He and Lehman are trying to get all this done and pretty unsuccessfully. But Lehman, as part of his kind of liberal agenda, takes up this getting rid of the quotas as well. And, keeps trying to introduce legislation, also fails again and again. But it's people like that, I have to say, I was struck too by the history. It's one of those things where if there isn't someone trying to do it, there's no way it happens. So even though the story is, I think this is where the narrative tension comes in the story, because you keep seeing how it's not going to happen. And it's sort of a shock to me when I was going through the history that it happens at all, because you see all these people trying and it's like a joke. Nobody thinks that it can happen. And Lehman is one of those people who tries, even though everybody says it's not possible, it's not possible. And it tells me, I think at least, that political efforts, even if they look like they're losing, if someone isn't even putting it on the table, there's no way to advance the argument, because by the time they get to 65, the arguments they're making are the very ones that were being made by people like Lehman. It's just that they don't have, as I was trying, like, JFK is assassinated in this very dramatic way, so they're more likely to do it. Like, the Francis Walter, who I mentioned in my excerpt, has to die of leukemia. Like, there are all these things that happen to happen, and then they shoot the moon. But that's only possible because someone has been making an argument for a moral argument over and over and over again over years, even if politically they can't win.
Yeah, that's such an important point for us all to remember, particularly now when things seem so desolate sometimes. You got to keep fighting. There's a question here from Wayne Senville. He says, growing up in the 1960s in New York, I recall immigration being viewed as a valued attribute of America and what made our country special. The concept of America as, quote, the melting pot was often spoken of, and in very positive terms. Do you know about the origins of the melting pot concept and how it took hold?
So this is in my book. If you're interested in this, I go into it in pretty big detail, but I'll go through it now. I loved learning this history. I had the very same question. There are all these phrases we learn and they become kind of shorthand, but they all have a particular history, and it actually tells you a lot about how we think about immigrants. So where is the melting pot from? It's from a play from, I'm forgetting the year now, but it was the 19-teens by a British Jewish playwright named Zangwill is his last name. And it was a hit on Broadway. It's, how to describe the plot. It's a play about, I think, a Jewish Russian family that comes. The main character is a man who's a composer and conductor. He's a musician, and he falls in love with a woman who I think is Christian and also an immigrant who's here. And there's a moment in the play where he is sort of ecstatically extolling the world that he's part of, right? This like melting pot. He describes it as all these people coming from Europe, right? This is, again, as I was saying, historically, all these people are coming from Europe in a way that we've never seen before because it's easier to come. And he has this giant monologue about the melting pot and says, essentially, all these people put together kind of are forging a new American identity. And that is what this is. And there's a glory to that. Now, I think what's interesting in that analogy, and Teddy Roosevelt, who was president, loved this play. I mean, he thought that it sort of said everything you could say about what was great about America. I'd say there's kind of another side to it though, right? Because the analogy is essentially one where you come as a distinct person and you come into the US as a melting pot, and then what comes out is uniform. So this metaphor became so popular that Henry Ford, which I describe in my book too, who's, the industrialist, the inventor of the car, he's employed a lot of immigrants. And as part of his work, he wants to also teach immigrants how to be American. So in addition to working in the factories, they're going to these classes, learning English, learning, American values. And when they graduate from the school, I found this amazing photo. they created a literal melting pot. I don't know what they make it out of, but it's like a giant, almost like paper mache black pot. And it says on the outside, the melting pot. When the immigrants graduate, they walked up a set of stairs, each wearing kind of their ethnic garb, like they look like they're from Italy or wherever. They step into this giant pot. And when they come out, they're all dressed the same, waving American flags. So that metaphor is so powerful, we still use it. But I think the origins are so interesting because they're basically saying they're all about a kind of assimilation where you come in as one thing. Teddy Roosevelt would rail against hyphenated Americans. He was really against the idea that you would be Italian American, Jewish American. He basically said, you've just got to be American. And that's the melting pot, I would argue.
So interesting. There's another question about just a sort of a technical question about your availability to give talks at universities, if you're able to give talks, and if you could recommend any other books that were particularly valuable to you in doing your research that you would recommend to people who are interested in the topic.
Yeah, I think the trouble is that part of why I wrote the book is that it's hard to find, I think, honestly, like very readable immigration law books. It's a very academic subject. So of course I humbly submit my book as like a readable version of it. I think there's a book that's a little bit academic, but I think is so important by a woman named May Nye, the scholar at Columbia, called Impossible Subjects. And it's all about kind of the creation of the idea of an illegal immigrant, which, you know, you'll learn in my book too, is like a total modern creation. We didn't always, I mean, for most of the time, we did not decide that there were legal and illegal immigrants. And her book is just so important. There's another book from the 1950s that I thought that is actually really beautifully written. It's all about the history of nativism in America. So that's called Strangers in the Land by John Hyam, you know, a long deceased historian who taught at Hopkins for many years. That book is really powerful because it really goes through and tells you, I think we forget the anti-Catholic nativism of this country and just how nasty that was. It goes through kind of all the anti-Semitism. I mean, all of these things I'd argue are very deeply linked. I think I set out to understand something about Asian American history, and what I found was actually like Jewish and Catholic history, because there are all these predecessor groups that encounter different forms of discrimination. They come in different shapes, right, and forms, but it's essentially the same idea of nativism, that there is a core American culture that is built around, you know, again, like white, Protestant, all of that. And anyone who comes in who's different is a threat to that ethnic identity, which, you know, to be fair, is how many countries view themselves. This is like you know, our country is doing something, I think, quite novel, which is to say that we aren't going to be defined by, you know, family lines and one ethnicity or one religion. But many people have over the years tried to argue for that. And every time we talk about immigration, I think we're really talking about that. We're not, you know, we're talking about visa this, visa that, border, but really it's at the heart of it, a question of who we want to be. And I would also argue those are really hard questions. You know, it's not as simple as, I think, unless we want open borders, which some people believe we should have, once you decide we're not going to have unlimited immigration, you get at really, I think, just very difficult to navigate questions about, so who's deserving? Is it the Afghan refugee? Or do you want someone who has technical skills, who can, you know, you have a doctor shortage in rural America, like bring more doctors in, like who, if you're going to have a limit, who actually gets priority? Is it the person who wants to be reunited with their, you know, with their child because they don't live in the same country, they want to come? All of those things are really tough. And the power of the 65 law, the one thing I will say that I think is very important to know about it, even though the people who did it really wanted to create a more multi-ethnic country, they did not anticipate that it would allow in so many people from outside Europe. And this is just a very important thing to, I think, realize as part of the political legacy of the law and where we are now. The reason there's so many Asian Americans and people from other parts is that the law said, if you have family already here, this is what the Trump administration called chain migration, you have a priority to be here. So that's why my family is here with, I have cousins and aunts and uncles. It's why there is this sheer volume, right? Because your family has priority. It links up in a chain. When they did that, they were trying to keep the country white. because at the time in the 60s, there were no Asian Americans here. I mean, there were, but like very, very small compared to now. There weren't many people from Africa, from the Middle East. It just wasn't, people could not imagine a country that looks the way it does now. So they thought that actually by prioritizing families and these chains, they could keep the country more ethnically homogeneous, right? They would keep it basically frozen in time. And what they didn't anticipate is that it would sort of spin out of that control and it would become where we are now. So I think that legacy is important to know, because I don't think as a country we politically ever said, this is what we want. We want to have millions of Asian Americans. We want to have millions of Mexican Americans. You know, that's what we want. We never quite stated that. We were trying to sort of right the wrongs that had been done before against Jews and Catholics, but we weren't looking toward a much more global future where we would have this many different ethnic groups in one country.
Yeah, and it's fascinating to think what the country might have looked like had that law not passed in 1965. We only have a couple of minutes left, and you know, but I do think it's important to sort of look forward. You know, you mentioned all the exogenous factors that lead to change, you know, but there's people working constantly. What do you see in the years ahead? I mean, immigration is used as such a political football. Is there a crisis at our border right now or not? And how do you see it sort of shaking out in the years ahead? Are there important trends that, do we need a new analysis of whether America should still remain a beacon for the rest of the world?
I think given our ethnic and racial diversity right now, it's going to be even harder, right? I mean, the thing I learned from my book and the work I did is just how hard it is to pass immigration reform. They were trying to really remake the whole system and they barely got it done. So I don't feel terribly optimistic. I mean, the system is completely broken. I think people just agree on that. They don't agree on what the system should be, but it's totally broken. I mean, you have people rushing at the border, trying to work around a broken visa system. You have people waiting years indefinitely for visas. The line doesn't exist. Some years we take in lots of refugees, some years we don't. Under Trump, you know, we banned people from Muslim majority countries, which I would argue is a complete echo of the ethnic quotas that we had before, and to rank, you know, countries by desirability. So I think we've created this kind of like legal monster of all these different visas, all these different rules. Our immigration system resembles more our criminal justice system now, with all of the hearings people have to go through, the judges, the courtrooms, the waits, the detention centers. I mean, we're just in a whole other world. And so I think to kind of get to a better place, I would argue we have to have the conversation we've been avoiding, I think Democrats included, which is, who do we want here? Yeah. Do you want to have more refugees? Does that mean fewer people of other stripes, you know, and categories? What do we want it to be? Because if it's simply we don't want, if Democrats just say we don't want Trump's system, that's still not a solution. That's just saying we don't want to do that. But then what do we want it to be? Yeah. Right? And how many can we take? How many do we want? And who do we want these people to be? And then when we're here, how do we actually treat people as full participants? We have so many people without the right papers who are living in the shadows. They can't participate in our democracy. That also strikes me as a broken system.
Right. Well, certainly your book will help us to try to navigate these waters ahead, because it's important to know where we've been in order to know where we're going. And it will definitely be informing the conversation in the years ahead. So we're out of time right now, but Jia Lynn, thank you so much for writing the book, for being here today, and for continuing your work on these very, very important topic. So
thank you all. It's really been an honor to be with you today.
And please, for those of you that are still participating, if you want to write any notes or messages to Jia Lynn, you can use the chat function, and we will make sure that she gets those. And thank you so much, everyone, for attending.
Thank you all. Take good care.
Take care.